Hello, this is KYC News. We provide you with the most up-to-date and reliable information for the day. First and foremost, we want to achieve perfect health with a sincere desire. China's pragmatic era has come to an end. China's pragmatic era has come to an end. While most countries are attempting to recover from the pandemic and return to normalcy, China's government has prioritized COVID as a national priority. Even as they wrap their population in a web of restrictions, struggle to find them jobs, and isolate them from the world, China's leaders continue to boast about victories against the coronavirus as the country's largest cities slowly emerge from weeks of economy-crushing shutdowns. There's no indication that this will change anytime soon. China's sports authorities recently announced that, because of COVID restrictions, the country will not host an Asian soccer competition that is set to begin in a year. It's tempting to question what's wrong with China's leadership after watching the country's frenzied struggle against COVID. In truth, China's pandemic fighting efforts are merely the most visible manifestation of a larger shift in the country's governance. The communist regime was cruel from the start, but it was also predictable and realistic in its own way. While most of the developing world has been racked by political turmoil in recent decades, China has stood out as a beacon of stability, with a leadership team that has changed on a regular basis and a clear policy direction. That has been the often overlooked cornerstone of China's rise on the international stage. Politics, on the other hand, is increasingly displacing pragmatism. The shift has been building for some years, but it is inextricably linked to Xi Jinping's ascendancy. He has concentrated more political power in his own hands than any other Chinese leader in decades, upending the more balanced, government-by-committee approach that had dominated since the 1980s, leaving the most important state decisions, and the future of the world's most populous country, in the hands of one man and his ideas, ambitions, and political calculations. Karl Minzner, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, believes China is entering a new period in which it begins to veer gradually more radically based on the whims of a single individual. The outcome could have a significant impact on China's global position, as well as international economics in general. Concerns about the future course of Chinese policies, reversing China's integration into the global economy and reorganizing supply chains, could cause multinational businesses, which are so important to the country's industrial juggernaut, to redirect their investment elsewhere. Beijing's relations with its Asian neighbors, as well as with the United States, might be further strained if its foreign policy becomes less predictable. Most importantly, China's 1.4 billion people, who are already unable to engage in their own government, will be sent adrift on the choppy waters of Chinese politics, and Xi's personal preferences. All of this amounts to a rerun of a more heinous moment in Chinese history. The political maneuverings and ideological ardor of Mao Zedong, the regime's creator, dominated the tumultuous early decades following the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. His every statement was communist dogma because he had such power. The Great Leap Forward, 1958-61, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 30 million people due to starvation, and the Cultural Revolution, 1966-76, which convulsed Chinese society in violence and disorder, were both the result of this unfettered authority. When Mao died in 1976, he left behind a government in shambles and a country in abject poverty. To some extent, the reform movement that followed was a reaction to the vicissitudes of one-man rule. Deng Xiaoping, China's new leader, was adamant about not erasing Mao's legacy. Deng once claimed that his accomplishments cannot be erased. However, he and his fellow reformers were successful in changing China's political system. Out with Mao's personality cult and in with Deng's credo of reform and opening up came a governance system based on power sharing, with regular leadership transfers and a well-defined policy platform. Though the system still stifled public debate, the broader framework allowed for more policy debate and the infusion of knowledge within the halls of power. The Chinese government became noted for its technocratic prowess, particularly in managing complicated economic development processes. Daniel Bell, the head of Shandong University's School of Political Science and Public Administration, suggested renaming the Communist Party the Chinese Meritocratic Union. These descriptions were overdone. The 1989 bloodshed in Tiananmen Square and the long-term calamity of the one-child policy were among the many failures of the reformist era. The new governing paradigm, on the other hand, was a huge success in other aspects. China became the world's workshop not only because of its low labor costs, but also because international investors could count on something far more rare and valuable: reliability. By seizing control of policies and marginalizing what little resistance there was within the party, Xi has destroyed this governing system. Nish Grunberg, the lead analyst of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, recently stated that he has worked hard and been effective in shaping decision-making procedures around his person. Following party policy now simply means following Xi's lead for all party officials. Loyalty to Xi has also become a key criterion in obtaining high-level positions in government agencies and other positions. Those having personal or professional ties to Xi, and or have exhibited loyalty and favorable engagement with his politics, Grunberg wrote, are overrepresented in the cohort of cadres promoted. This has totally altered how China's leadership makes decisions at the highest levels. As authority has begun to reconcentrate at the top and increasingly in a single person, Minzner noted, there is less scope to debate issues. The comparatively more predictable technocratic road, which people are used to being followed, is now starting to deviate rather more unpredictably. The big test for China's communal governance system may be approaching. At a Communist Party Congress later this year, Xi is generally expected to defy the regular rotation of senior leaders and stay in power for a third term, something none of his reform-era predecessors have done, and might conceivably maintain the presidency for life. Beijing's uneven and perplexing policies, including 0% COVID, are largely the result of these longer-term and structural adjustments. The policy, which aims to keep COVID infections at or near zero, has saved lives, so sticking to it makes sense. However, there is clearly dissatisfaction with the policy's current direction at the highest echelons of government and business. Premier Li Keqiang, who is officially No. 2 in the leadership hierarchy but has been largely ignored by Xi, has suddenly found his voice and has repeatedly warned of the harm being done to economic growth and jobs, the latter of which is of particular concern to a Communist Party fearful of social disorder. Xi, on the other hand, has repeatedly stated that zero COVID is accurate, and that the case is resolved in his opinion. Meanwhile, there are no practical alternatives to zero COVID. China watchers are perplexed by Beijing's reluctance to vaccinate the country's vulnerable elderly. More than 90 million individuals over the age of 60 are unvaccinated, though they have recently increased their efforts. Instead, the country is still encircled by severe limitations. The government imposed restrictions on citizens abroad travel in mid-May. Buying ibuprofen in a Beijing drugstore raises the suspicions of local health officials, who subsequently demand that the customer do a COVID test. Beijing and Shanghai appear to be enacting a continual surveillance regime. Many aspects of daily life require an up-to-date COVID test, such as entering office buildings, dining in restaurants, or riding the subways, forcing inhabitants to spend time and effort getting swabbed on a regular basis. COVID guidelines aren't the only ones that cause confusion. Even economic policy, which was once the party's strongest suit, has become exceptionally unstable. The government started a rapid and disorganized attack on big tech in late 2020. Regulators revoked the stock listing of fintech powerhouse Ant Group just 2 days before its debut, then pushed Didi Chuxing, the ride-hailing service, to announce its delisting from the New York Stock Exchange 5 months later. In a recent review of the Chinese economy, the generally mild-mannered International Monetary Fund slammed Beijing, citing the multiplicity, timing, seemingly uncoordinated, and discretionary nature of these measures. It has resulted in increased policy uncertainty, he says. Now, as the economy struggles under zero COVID restrictions, policymakers are making a quick retreat. Senior officials schmoozed IT leaders at a meeting in mid-May, promising help for overseas stock listings among other things. Xi, like Mao, can send officials rushing with just a few words. Last August, he gave a talk about shared prosperity, or closing economic gaps, and the idea quickly became the talk of the town, with executives rushing to open their wallets for needy farmers and other philanthropic organizations. However, the tagline has yet to be translated into a well-thought-out policy framework, adding to the uncertainty. In an email, Bert Hoffman, the head of the National University of Singapore's East Asian Institute, told me that shared prosperity remained an aspirational objective, with real measures needed to be established. Xi's strategy resembles earlier Maoist mass campaigns in this regard. The disastrous Great Leap Forward was planned by Mao on the basis of his belief that China could leapfrog into the ranks of advanced economies only via public effort. Workers and farmers just had to work harder and for longer periods of time while remaining committed to the communist cause. Xi appears to believe that COVID may be overcome by national willpower as well. Xi and his administration have described pandemic efforts as an almost militaristic movement against an invisible enemy, requiring tremendous sacrifice as well as solidarity and resilience to win victory. China can only go backwards so far. Xi is not Mao, and neither is his agenda. Xi, on the other hand, runs the risk of undoing the successes won in the preceding 2 decades. Zero COVID, for example, is making overseas businesses wary of China. According to a recent survey conducted by the American Chamber of Commerce in China, more than half of those polled had postponed or curtailed their investments in the nation. The issue, according to Jörg Wuttke, head of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, is the policy's unpredictability. In a recent briefing, he remarked, "The predictability of the Chinese market was traditionally one of its assets, and that has gone out the window." In China's foreign policy, the same may be said. Yun Sun, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, recently observed, Xi has constructed a new model of foreign policy decision-making that is based on his absolute authority. Xi, his strategic personality, and his foreign policy vision are the fundamental origins of China's foreign policy behavior today, and the assertiveness and coercion manifested are the direct result of Xi's political beliefs and the system he has designed to enforce his vision, according to the report. As a result, security analysts will have to account for Xi's personal goals and political considerations when forecasting Chinese foreign policy. For example, Beijing has long claimed Taiwan to be a primary priority. Now, it's possible to argue that one individual wielding Chinese power, unconstrained by an administration full of cronies, makes a fight over the island more conceivable, similar to Vladimir Putin's grab for Ukraine. This is where Xi distinguishes himself from Mao, both in terms of the China he governs and the larger impact he has. The Chinese people bore the brunt of Mao's misfortunes. That's terrible enough, but in a world where China is a rising power with vastly increased economic and military power, Xi's leadership will have a significant impact on all of us. That means that one man's whims have the power to boost or sink the global economy, as well as to plunge the world into violence and chaos. Xi's centralization of power, though, isn't all bad from an American standpoint. Xi may be undermining China's competitive edge in its competition with Washington by marginalizing technocrats and restricting policy debates. His emphasis on zero COVID, unpredictable attitude toward the private sector, and aggressive foreign policy are suffocating the economy, depressing investor mood, alienating additional countries, and isolating China from the rest of the globe. All of this does not speak well for China's future as a great power rival. In some ways, Xi is demonstrating why proponents of democracy believe authoritarian regimes eventually collapse. Under one-man control, communist China was a shambles. It's possible it'll happen again.